a second.
And we're my mouse to click continue. Okay.
All right. And we're back. This is segment 3 of episode 411 of the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McColl. My very special guest needs no introduction today. Ioan Grillo. I want to say Grillo because we're in Latin America, but Ioan Grillo, a journalist par excellence, based in Mexico, author of Blood, Gun, Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels, Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America, and of course, El Narco inside Mexico's criminal insurgency. Welcome, and thank you for agreeing to come on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Hey, Richard, good to be here.
It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. I pestered you enough, and now you're here. And so thank you for that. And of course, recording this in your spare time, busy guy. Let's just start with the basics. You you came to Latin America. You've been here since 2001. It's a tricky time now, 2022. Only recently in your home city up there in Mexico now, there have been protests because of the nature of how, deaths in journalism. I think in 20 years, it's more than 160 journalists there in Mexico. You're taking on these stories. Tell us how it feels to be a journalist up there right now.
Yeah, so thanks. And yeah, I arrived in Mexico actually the end of 2000, started working as a journalist in 2001, began for an English language newspaper called The News, run by a Mexican sister paper called Novedades. And I worked there for a couple of years and carried on and got into freelancing and then worked for news agencies and newspapers. And so it's been a long ride. It's very depressing and tragic with the murder of Mexican journalists, the vast majority. There've been a few foreign journalists killed here as well. One American journalist, Bradley Ronan Will, was killed in 2006. An American journalist was killed around 97, a bit before I arrived, 97, 98 here. And a couple of other, there's a Honduran journalist killed, but the vast majority have been Mexican citizens and from here. And it's very depressing and tragic. I covered stories of journalist murders going back to my early years here, 2004, 2005, did these stories and covered then the issues of newspapers being intimidated, being threatened, journalists being murdered. And it just carried on and it's got worse and worse. And then we had big protests. There was a big wave of journalist murders from about 2011, 2012. You start seeing a big murders, these high profile murders of Regina Martinez, who's a reporter for a news magazine called Proceso here in Mexico, biggest news magazine in the country. And she was murdered, and there's a whole series. And then, you got to 2017, when Javier Valdez, a very renowned, very famous journalist from Sinaloa, who was also a friend of mine, was murdered in his home state of Sinaloa. And, and waves of protests. And then we get to 2022 and 3 journalists killed in, almost a week. 3 journalists were murdered. So very, very depressing. In this time, protests, letters, statements made, demands, and then you get the mechanism to protect journalists gets created. Doesn't help. In fact, journalists who are murdered were inside this mechanism to protect journalists, which is kind of some system where people who feel threatened should go into. There was creation of a special prosecutor to prosecute crimes against journalists. Again, hasn't stopped this. So very, very, very sad. And just continues. And on the, trying to find a positive note of this really depressing thing is the fact that that I've still seen in the 20 years I've been in Mexico, Mexican colleagues still carrying on doing great work. A great generation of journalists since I've been here. At all kinds of different levels, from people who are writing, great books, directly accusing the government, the real big names, to the people with the massive radio shows and TV shows who are also doing good cutting edge stuff, people like Carmen Aristegui, to loads of great journalists in all over the country. And, still when I go to any places that can be Apatzingán, Michoacán, Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Tijuana, in finding the colleagues there working in the field, digging up the daily news stories, and they're still doing it despite the wave of murders.
I mean, that's the similarity, of course, with Colombia. Obviously, the threat level is so much higher for local journalists. I mean, Colombian journalists, Mexican journalists. Do you find yourself somewhat sheltered, being obviously not from Mexico?
Well, first, the wave of murders, it's not only been about just Mexican journalists, but also specifically has mainly been Mexican journalists living in the towns and cities, particularly where the cartels are strongest. So hasn't been, in fact, the real big names in Mexico City who have been being killed. It's generally been people, and often people working for more local publications who have been hit. So that's one thing, is that like Mexico is a very dynamic country. It's a very varied country. And so, and I tell this to people, and some of the Americans don't believe me, but I tell them that Mexico City has actually got a lower murder rate than about 40 American cities right now. But you've got places like Tijuana, which have got some of the worst murder rates in the world. So it's very varied in that sense. When now this issue of murdering journalists is complicated, but cartels, drug cartels, are a huge part of this. Often working with local authorities, police who are corrupt, and it's kind of a narco complex of corrupt police and law enforcement and drug traffickers. But they're a huge factor. Now, when I go to these places to work, which are very intense and very crazy, some of these places. I mean, just got back from Michoacán, the hotland of Michoacán, the Michoacán-Jalisco border, which is just, these are crazy. These are areas of this kind of weird hybrid armed conflict. I mean, these are really out there when you see that on the field, these places. But you can go to these places and go and live that craziness for a while and then go home. Whereas people who live in those areas, they can't get away from that. So some of these a small town like Apatzingán, Michoacán, Reynosa, Tamaulipas, you go, there's a very intense cartel. You go there, you might be at a murder scene where there's cartel guys present. You might interview a cartel hitman or a cartel affiliate. And then you could be going to the cinema, going to the shops, and you see these same people around. So you're much more intense, very close, and they know where you live. So it's much more intense there. Now, I wouldn't, from the point of view of saying, I'm a foreign journalist, I wouldn't want to tempt fate by saying I'm in some way protected. I've got like an invisibility shield, because you see very intense situations. And, you see in some cases, it's actually very few journalists who have died from shootouts, but there have been cases with journalists who have been covering these big shootouts and just been hit by a stray bullet, doesn't recognize who you are. But also, some of these cartel murderers, I mean, these can be sometimes 17-year-old kids with AK-47s, who are not really that accountable. And there have been various cases of myself and various foreign journalists in the last few years who have been held up by armed groups and had equipment taken away, and someone's been held for some time at gunpoint and had equipment taken away, and had threats made. So it's not, it still has been a difficult and rough place to report on.
You were held up and had your equipment taken away recently?
So there's been some various colleagues I know, at least 3 cases of foreign journalists who have been held up and had their equipment taken away in the last 3 years. One in Sinaloa, one in Tijuana, one in Guerrero. I've never had that. I have had one time somebody threatening to, one time they accused me of being a DEA agent and threatened to they shoot me in the head if they saw me again. But in that case, they didn't take my equipment away or hold me down like in other cases where the colleagues were like held down at gunpoint for like an hour or so.
This is trauma-inducing stuff. How do you wind down after, like, so let's say, an intense reporting job in Reynosa, which has been described to me by someone in the sort of executive security industry as one of the greatest shitholes on earth? How do you wind down from something like that? I mean, because you're up in it. And seeing such things, because this brings me a little bit to your latest book, Blood, Gun, Money, and you are visibly, well, not visibly, I mean, we read it and how affected you are. And there's a young girl who's paralyzed from the waist down and just lies on her bed all day. And this, just through reading through the lines, there's a trauma there, PTSD.
Yeah. So I've been doing this now for 20 years, and it's, I think you get used to it with time. It is hard, and before like maybe 10 years ago, I remember doing running around covering these really intense things, and then going home and finding it a bit hard to kind of slow to change level, and like be in the supermarket with a trolley, and you suddenly, like, before a really, really intense situation, you kind of having that, turning it off, or going, I remember covering the prison fire in Honduras is 2012. There was 360 deaths. You saw the smell of charred bodies in the cells of this prison, and that's the biggest prison tragedy ever in the world. 360 dead. Running around covering that, and then kind of hitting a bar and drinking half a bottle of rum, trying to calm the nerves. But I think over time I got more used to this, to try and not turn it on, turn it off, try and pace myself a bit covering these things. And I think it is emotionally, it is weird. And this kind of goes for a lot of journalists, I think, doing this kind of stuff. You go there, you with people, you see like a lot of intense suffering. You see people, like the case of a young girl who was paralyzed from the waist down. In fact, she died shortly before the book was published. She died later on, and connected to her injuries. Real tragic case. So you've got to see these things, see these cases of people really suffering, or be spend time with gangsters, with serial murderers, be around it, and then kind of switch off and go back, and you kind of get used to that. Kind of switching on and off, and that kind of and used to trying to assess the levels. I mean, recently I was spending time in a couple of meetings with the federal policeman who was, well, he'd actually been kicked out of the federal police, and he had various beefs, and I was talking to him, and then he was murdered. And so you suddenly got this kind of like, oh, is that a big alarm? How do you assess these kind of panics of things? And you had a lot of these, you kind of get used to them. And partly, it is a freaky place, covering the kind of violence in Mexico. So I've worked well with a lot of foreign TV crews who come in and aren't used to it, and people just like it can create and induce a lot of fear. How can I go and cover that, or and you kind of get used to turning off and just trying to assess the threats and not be too freaked out by these situations as well.
I'm very, very lightweight alongside this. So it's, down here in Colombia seems positively demure alongside what you're doing. I'm curious because, I mean, you write your principle. One of your big things, obviously, is the war on drugs. Obviously, this is funding what's going on in Mexico for a large part. Of course, what we are here in Colombia. And you wrote an editorial or an opinion piece in the New York Times. War on drugs, and of course, it must end now. And I've been thinking about this, and of course, it's 1971. It's Nixon, and that war, as they call it, hasn't evolved. It's all about, sort of eradication and military aid and so on. And this has been a huge, hugely damaging to Colombia, really. I mean, we've got a militarized society all through this. Do you have sort of thoughts on this, you know, Colombia, Mexico related? What I mean, how we're at a real crossroads here at Colombia right now, with the elections coming up later in the year. And of course, well, fortunately, the aerial fumigation of glyphosate was ruled for now. It's been overruled, you know, the recommencement of this, because they didn't talk to the communities who'd be affected. But I mean, this is known to be damaging as well. I mean, you know, obviously we produce so much of what goes up to Mexico and so much which funds it. I find ourselves in this tricky situation. Mexico not only is let's say a transshipment country, but they also produce other. That I think there's opium, and I think there's amphetamines and meth and everything else. So, I mean, it's a complex situation.
So with the war on drugs, I do think there's been a development. I think you have. So the war on drugs being declared by Richard Nixon in 1971. And I would say that kind of phase of the war on drugs lasts until about the turn of the millennium, where America really is kind of into this war on drugs. And, you know, you see different presidents with it. And so you see, you know, Ronald Reagan and really embraces it. And then they have all the big work in Florida, and bringing in the Navy and the Miami Task Force, or South Florida Task Force, and all this kind of stuff, which kind of makes it more difficult to take cocaine directly from Colombia right over the sea directly into the United States. And then you get pushed more to Mexico. And then you have, you know, still with Bill Clinton, you have a certain, you know, still, you know, a certain enthusiasm, and then the taking down of Pablo Escobar in 1993. I would say, by the turn of the millennium, and definitely after 2001, if we want to have a marker, September 11th, America losing interest in the war on drugs and not really having the same belief in it as it did then. So I argue that after that, now we go into a zombie war on drugs. So whereas the original war on drugs, and you see that if you look at the speeches of Richard Nixon, we can abolish drugs from American life. We can transform, in a very absolutist promise, there would be no drugs, so that American parents would not worry about their kids taking heroin. And then still with Ronald Reagan, just say no, which back in the UK, we had a weird version on the Grange Hill. Also just say no. If anyone was old enough to remember Grange Hill,
I remember.
And Zamo, you know, taking Zamo smokes the dragon and gets a smack on the mouth, I think was the so the we have these things there in the UK, and then you know, still with Clinton, and if you go back to some of these times in the 90s, you know, 80s, 90s, there'd be surveys be like, what's the number one issue in the United States? People would say drugs. I mean, this was, you know, nowadays, you know, I mean, well, actually drug addiction is a huge issue now, but it's different in that, you know, I don't see from definitely from post 9/11 onwards, there's not this same enthusiasm. It wasn't such the real driving attempt. For a while, kind of drugs went off the agenda. Now, since 2020, we've seen this massive increase in deaths, and now we've got a horrific issue with drug addiction in the United States and drug deaths. But it's not even then still really an enthusiasm for the kind of real hardcore. I mean, maybe they'll regain it again, but a kind of hardcore approach from, you know, at high levels are promising it. But we get these prohibitionist policies carrying on and these militarized policies carrying on. Now, the way that Colombia and Mexico developed, and other countries in Latin America, the problem is then it's connected to drugs in a big way, and particularly to drug money. So, you know, all this drug money pouring in now, the numbers, we don't know the real numbers, but we've got vague estimates. I mean, you look on the US side, there's a White House survey, what Americans spend on illegal drugs, estimates about $150 billion a year. It's hard to know exactly how much of that really goes to Mexico. But we're talking about tens of billions a year over decades, reaching $1 trillion kind of levels. So this money gets pumped in, and funding murderers, corrupting police, really tilting the system. So the problem is then you have in Mexico right now, particularly, this situation with generally very, very violent armed groups, as well as corrupt and violent security forces. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds, but it's not actually as easy as pressing a button and pressing the stop button on this. It's become a kind of weird thing that you can't win and you can't pull out of so quite as easily. As an example of that, you get places where, like there's a military there, and there's also a very violent cartel there, and then the military pull out, and then the cartel are doing heavy extortion or kidnapping, and then a bunch of residents get up, and then the military go back in again. Suddenly so it's kind of this back and forth, which we're stuck in right now. And we can say and give these solutions, like in my 3 books I always write about these solutions of like being one area drug policy reform, which I do believe in, one area prevention and transforming communities where the criminals are coming from, and one area building a justice system that actually works. We can say these things, but saying them is very different, is a long way from them really being put into practice. And politicians are not great in Mexico. They're pretty terrible in many of Mexico, but also dealing with the very hard reality of Mexican politics.
Yeah, definitely. We wrestle with ideas here, and of course there's all this sort of, let's say, celebrating when a capo is taken down, and it's big in its front page news, the Chapo or Escobar 93. And only recently President Duque tried to claim that the capture, in inverted commas, of Otoñel, the leader of the Clan del Golfo, would then it would lead to a reduction in the killings of social leaders and community leaders, which of course it hasn't. And of course there's been no drop in the production of cocaine and things like. So I mean, how do you feel when you see this next thing? It's like, well, we're going for the head again, but it doesn't really solve anything. I mean, really the Medellin cartel never went away. It just sort of evolved into different cartels, less flamboyant. For example, when Escobar went, maybe it wasn't Escobar anymore. He did kind of do himself a major disservice by running as a politician, bringing himself into very much public knowledge and so on and so forth. Now we see different types of cartel leaders. But how are things being addressed there in Mexico? Is there an actual coherent plan?
No. Yeah, it's the short answer. No,
that's fine.
I think with the kingpin strategy and the idea of taking down these big kingpins clearly failed, and often it creates more violence because in Mexico you have you take down, and there's one very powerful cartel was run by a guy called Arturo Beltran Leiva. He was taken down, and suddenly you get this big breakup of these groups under him, and then you get the kind of the fragment of the fragment of the fragment, and these kind of young hitmen suddenly running these really violent groups and carrying out a bunch of horrific murders and crimes. The problem is, and it gets to kind of double bind here, is that so this current president has backed away from the kingpin strategy to an extent. I mean, he said we're not going after kingpins. The problem is he hasn't really got an alternative plan as well. So it doesn't, if you don't go after them, they haven't really got an alternative plan as well. The violence just carries on. So he takes heat for still very high levels of homicide. One of the problems is it's bad. Going after the kingpins doesn't work, but it is also bad to allow impunity. So if you have got the head of a cartel that's committed a very large amount of murders, I mean, even forgetting about the drugs issue itself, but if someone's committed a bunch of murders and kidnappings and extortion and horrific acts, should you just not go after that person, not arrest them? That's a bad thing as well. So it's kind of a double bad thing. So either way, though, whether you go after them or not, and I think sometimes you shouldn't allow real criminals to flagrantly move around, but there's got to be a bigger plan. So again, a long-term plan, drug policy reform. I think they have to talk about this or reach it at some point. Drug policy reform, which is a complicated question, really what it means. It's not as simple, again, as a button you press and all drugs become legalized. But I think, drug policy reform, and Mexico is such a moral high ground to better start talking about this. As you start seeing some politicians talk about this, but it's become, and there have been some movement, with drug policy reform, but it started to kind of hit a bit of a some speed bump, really. But drug policy reform meaning looking at harm reduction, accepting the premise that the war on drugs idea. So 1971, Richard Nixon promised there would be no drugs. In the late 90s, there was a United Nations drug conference, and actually had the slogan there, "A drug-free world, we can do it." They were still with this kind of ideas, these like fantasy ideas, and accepting this is realism. People are taking drugs. Unless you really want to have a very, very powerful authoritarian approach, even more authoritarian than we've got now, executing every drug dealer or something, you're not going to stop this because the money incentives are too high. So accepting that people take drugs and how we reduce the damage. Now, I really think this is not easy because, I think we should legalize marijuana. I think that debate has largely been won, although there's still some people pushing against it. But then, how do we actually deal with heroin? How do we deal with crystal meth? How do we deal with cocaine? And these are still tougher questions. But we need to have debate about this and at least, try and reduce the consumption, the buying of these. I think that's a big part of it in terms of drug money. But also, how do you build law enforcement? How do you build police forces that actually function and that protect people? That's a very tough one, and that's a conversation that, when in Mexico they're constantly throwing these things of like creating new names and purifying this. It's like, but it's very basic. But that, again, it's like, how do you need that? There needs to be protection of people. It's not good to live in a society with 36,000 murders in a year. It's not good to live in a society with 90% of murders going unsolved, and in some states 98% of murders going unsolved. Those are not good conditions.
It's terrifying figures. We've been going through, I think the police force here in Colombia is going through one of its lowest ever ebbs, in terms of people's trust in the institution. Of course, one of the big issues is that it's still it falls under the umbrella and under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense. So therefore, and this is obviously something that's carried over from the conflict, but they behave like an armed force. And of course, you'll have known about the protests last year, and it's the official figure is around 40 people killed during the protests, but the actual figure is probably much higher. There are still people unaccounted for today, and these questions, and these the court cases and the investigations keep getting put back, and then they do something like change the uniforms because they're going to look a bit more accessible, but the big deal is they need to be taken out of the Ministry of Defense, and put into the Interior or something else. But of course, they won't get the same money because it's almost like a national sovereignty thing because of the internal conflict. But it's all this mess that we've got. But to keep it short, if I were a policeman, I don't earn enough to save someone else's life. That's the truth. I don't earn enough, and I don't know that my family is going to be looked after should something happened to me. And of course, that temptation of taking a cut somewhere else is, it's almost self-preservation in a lot of circumstances. I don't condone it, but there's this issue. But I want to jump on a bit, because whenever we get something sort of more sinister stuff going on here in Colombia, then there's always an implication or an indication, and some journalists write it. I don't know how much knowledge they have or how accurate it is, but they do say that there's the interference and intervention of the Nuevo Jalisco cartel and the Sinaloa down here in Colombia. Now, I don't doubt that they're working hand in hand with the Clan del Golfo and other outfits, Pelusos, et cetera, and of course the dissident FARC and probably the ELN, guerrillas, and so on. But how much do you know about this connection between the two countries? Have your investigations revealed some of this?
Yeah, sure. So obviously this is a relationship which is now between Mexican traffickers and Colombian traffickers, drug producers. Is a relationship that goes back to the 1970s at least. And so you can see some of these. This first Colombian trafficker had the nickname El Mexicano, guy from Medellin, and he was up here in Mexico. There was some documents I've seen with him being in Mexico's 79, those kind of times. So pre Pablo Escobar, there was already connections. Even before the Reagan really clamped down on the Florida route, there was connections already between Colombians and Mexican gangsters. And then you see this now. I talked to one pilot who was, I cite in my book quite briefly, but longer interviews done with him, where he was flying cocaine a lot from Colombia to Mexico, and talking about the deals that were being made going through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And he, was talking about this whole development. So, it used to be the Colombians paying the Mexicans an amount per kilo. So, we'll give you the cocaine, pay you amount per kilo, you deliver it to us in the United States, and then we distribute it. And then gradually, then it became, for a while, a 60-40, and then we'll pay you in cocaine, and then became 50-50, and then became the Mexicans gradually buying and paying a price per kilo. I attended some of the trial of El Chapo, and there's recordings there of El Chapo with Colombian figures, or was meant to be El Chapo. There's lawyers saying we can't really tell if it's his voice. This kind of this very Sinaloan accent. Oye, los muebles están ahí. It's like these kind of rough recordings that you're hearing. And so going there now, with the current rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is a real power and a real presence, and now competing with the Sinaloa Cartel as the most powerful force in Mexico, the biggest force in Mexico. You're definitely seeing them with big links down to Colombia and very, very broad, as well as Sinaloa Cartel. So continuing to do this. So this is being another thing that you want to talk about this separately. One of the things that's cited in the book is the whole weapons transfer and weapons deals. So in Mexico, there is a huge country for trafficking guns from the United States into Mexico, including guns such as rifles that fire 50 caliber bullets, Barrett 50s. And then it trades them down into Colombia. And, this pilot said it very well, that, it's about business, and there's no point in flying a plane down and paying for the fuel and flying it down empty. If you're flying it back with cocaine, fly it down with guns, tequila, riding saddles, whatever else they want from Mexico. You stash it full of stuff. So you bring down, so you see these chains. Now, other chains I've seen, the interesting connections between cartels, and this was going back a couple of years. There was a few car bombs going off here, and an explosives specialist in US agency looked at some of these car bomb circuits, and these are the same circuits that they had down in Colombia. Now, those circuits were said to be the same circuits that they use in Northern Ireland. These IRA figures, and there's a famous case of these IRA figures going to selling this technology, to the Colombians. So you see all these kind of, Colombian, and there's various Colombian gangsters up here in Mexico as well who actually become players here in the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. There was a Colombian figure, but there's various as well that actually there's a lot of back and forth.
It was I believe the Irish bird watchers, wasn't it? They were.
That's correct. That's correct.
They were bird watchers. They're back there sipping tea in Ireland. I know that because they skipped bail, didn't they, and got back. And yes, that was a big deal. And of course, that led to all our Irish people who wanted to come to Colombia had to get visas, because that was immediately the reaction. The visa requirement has since been lifted. But then, your book, yes, now that the arms, as you say, this flow, I was so amazed at the figures of guns being sold in this kind of gray area between legal and illegal, and then of course being in the hands of, I don't know, in sort of failed DEA operations that led to the deaths of DEA operatives, and there's those guns then come on down. I mean, cases and cases, thousands and thousands of guns. And as you say, once they're in Mexico and the planes coming down and so on, and some of the other things was you talked all about it. You got, I guess it was it Menem brokering guns for up here, Carlos Menem from Argentina, that came through the Balkans and so on. I mean, this network is just, it covers everything. And I don't think it's talked about enough, because it goes hand in hand with let's say, the inverted commas war on drugs as well, because it's, the two go together. So your book reveals this to quite an extent. I mean, first of all, how have the sales been?
It's been good. Guns are not as an easy sell as drugs, funny enough. And my first book, El Narco, was a very big seller, and partly I think I was the timing as the Mexican drug war was really starting to explode then. And I think there was, in some ways, particularly for Americans, more of an appetite at that time to kind of know about foreign issues. Guns are a tougher seller in some ways. It was when I first got into this and was like jumping into writing about one of America's very biggest sacred issues, guns. So I made a big effort to try and understand as well, get all the facts right. I mean, really big effort, because I've written about this gun issue for many years in Mexico, and I realized, that the gun enthusiasts, the gun, in some cases, the Second Amendment fanatics, or fundamentalists are very, very keen. Look exactly what you do and go through with a red pen. So get all the facts right. Go spend time around these massive gun shows and gun trade fairs. Talk as well with militia members and the head of the AR-1500s of America, and try and get that. Now, this issue, so I came for this as well, like, I'm not going against the Second Amendment, I'm against the selling of guns to drug cartels, the selling of guns to gangsters. This is an issue also you've got in the United States with a lot of firearm deaths and rising firearm deaths. And these same guns from the United States are reaching 100 and more than 75 different countries a year, 130 different countries around the world, including Colombia and basically right across the entire continent of the Americas, but also far away as Asia, Africa, these guns are reaching. And it's a tough issue. It's kind of now one of the good signs. I mean, the book was cited in a lawsuit filed by the Mexican government against gun companies in the United States.
Wow.
So that was, and it's good to see that now. This has been, I think, part of, with this lawsuit happening and with various amount of media coverage, you've now seen this issue of guns become much more firmly put in the agenda of US-Mexico. So that's a good thing. Like now you see all these bilateral talks, and there's various things coming out. Just an announcement just from yesterday from the US ambassador here saying we've got other talks about how to stop this. On the sadder side, I see in the United States, and one of the things that's kind of mind-boggling for me is there's so much low-hanging fruit they're not taking in trying to tackle this issue. And what I mean by that is, when we look at some of the issues, like how do you build a police force that works in Mexico, that's a pretty daunting task. But some of these issues is like, how do you stop a cartel guy walking into a shop and buying 85 firearms in the United States? That doesn't seem that hard to do. It seems mad that somebody can walk in a shop and go, I'll have 85 guns, please. Like, and there's no like alarm going off going, who's this guy? How come he's paying in cash? How come this guy's 23 years old without an official job? So these basic stuff, this basic low-hanging fruit in these cases where you have people abusing a kind of loophole in the law and people selling 1,000 guns through gun shows where they're already buying and selling, they're not even clamping down on that. They're not stopping that. So they're not doing the very most basic thing of like trying to stop this flow, and where you see estimates of more than 200,000 firearms a year go from the United States to Mexico. Now, what's frustrating, and I was even wondering when I wrote the book and it came out in February last year, would I be too late? And would they have already, Biden's going to win, Democrats are going to take the houses, they're bound to pass universal background checks. Maybe I'll be even late to the game of pointing this stuff out because they'll actually deal with it. Didn't I? Then Biden came along and made a speech saying we're going to talk about guns. Nothing's come of it. I've been invited to some of these forums about this, and asking, well, they're saying, well, they don't have the numbers. They still don't have the numbers now. There's still Democrats in certain districts with a lot of, there's still this issue of guns is managing even now to kind of clog this up. Even though that, surveys find 89% of Americans, the majority of gun owners and conservatives are in favor of universal background checks. They're still not even able to move on this basic stuff. So that's kind of a bit depressing. And I feel the problem with one of the problems, I think, one of many problems in American politics right now, but one of the problems in American politics, and I think from the point of view of the left in America right now, although supposedly we're seeing a time of a kind of big resurgence of the left and much more of a consciousness and so forth, if we're talking in general terms, the left is very bad about dealing with concrete issues and trying to find concrete solutions. So a lot of these, left commentators, left politicians, they're not, and I feel this issue on guns, and also the fact that there's a lot of Americans dying of gun violence, and there's a lot of these same issues could try and help reduce that. They're not actually, really coming to try and confront these concrete issues head on.
I mean, that's exactly as you say, the left, and actually it feeds very well into here the elections. The front runner at the moment is, of course, the leftist Gustavo Petro, who has a lot of ideas, but again, these concrete actions. When we saw him as mayor of Bogota all those years ago, the concrete actions were lacking. Good chatter, good conversation, and then infighting with the other leftists. That's what I always find. It ends up being this way. So, I mean, you've got these 3 books, you write continually. What's the next project then, Ioan?
So right now I've been getting very much into making TV series.
Nice.
Over the last year. I mean, I've been messing around back and forth with TV for a long time. But right now I've got into a bit of the bandwagon of the high-end, streaming platform TV stuff.
Good stuff.
Sadly, I mean, I've spent 20 years working around newspapers and magazines. Sadly, they're not what they used to be in terms of budgets. There's been a lot of changes. I mean, there's still some good stuff happening, but there's there's a bit of a boom in the TV industry, and it's very interesting. So I've been working on 2 big TV projects of different TV series connected to Mexico and the US.
Nice.
It's been I've been really kind of on these since the book was published. It kind of happened right away. So I kind of jumped right into this and have been really kind of, so right now writing some pre-shooting scripts, sitting around with script writing programs and dealing with that, and a bit nervous about the pressure. One of the big pressures of these TV series is, you have to line up all these people who have to show up, and then made them go for long TV interviews. But it's been that's been good. So I've been doing that right now, and I'm certainly going to write more books, but I'm not sure what the next book is right now. I don't have the exact title in the cooker yet.
It's in your head. I know it's in your head. When will we see you down here in Colombia?
I always love to come down to Colombia. It's a country I love very much, and always sure. I haven't got a date planned yet, but I'm sure I'll be back there at some point.
All right. Well, look me up when you're down. Listen, thank you so much for your time. It goes without saying, stay safe on all of these jobs that you're doing, because we don't need you as another statistic out there. Everyone out there, I've read it and I enjoyed it massively. Blood, Gun, Money: How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. It takes a different look, at the problems from the the context of the arms trade, and I think that's really fascinating. That's why I liked it. I mean, I read enough books on drugs, obviously being located here. Toby Muse's Kilo, which was very good this last couple of years, and so on. But this was really interesting, and I recommend it to all of you out there. Can I just say, Ioan Grillo, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing some of your insights and being so, unselfish with your knowledge.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for the invite.
It's a great pleasure. I've been Richard McColl talking to Ioan Grillo. He's in Mexico City. I'm in Bogota. This has been episode 411. Please continue to tune in. We continue to have great interviewees on this podcast. I'll be back next week. Bye-bye.